The big deal here is that this new contracting template that the VA is launching nationally is a bit of a game changer for P&O. It actually puts a price and an importance on outcomes and on follow-up. And no payer has done this before, right? No, at no point yet in the history of third-party payers have they said, oh, we think outcome measures are super important. We think knowing how the patient utilized the prosthesis or orthosis after they got it and how it helped them later is so important that we're going to pay you to do it. Nobody's done that. Right. So, and in this template, we'll see they're actually basically doing exactly that. Also, nobody has said, we think that follow up is so important. We're actually going to pay you to follow up on your patients. And again, this template says that. So, some really big, cool changes that actually would be nice if other payers would adopt are coming down the line with this. So let's jump into it. No more talk about what we're about to talk about. Let's talk about it. So the overview of what we're going to talk about, we're going to look at the highlights from the VA OIG report. So if that term OIG report sounds familiar, you'll recall in 2010, 2011, the Office of Inspector General, the OIG, put out a report about prosthetics and all the ways we were being bad people by billing inappropriately, et cetera. That report came out, and of course, we've been living with the ramifications ever since. Well, the VA got the same type of oversight and had the same review or a similar review by the OIG. And I want to point out here that let's do a quick government review too. What is the OIG? Where does it come from? Who tells the Office of Inspector General, go over there to that department and start investigating them? Who says that? And the bottom line, the very bottom line of who says that is us, taxpayers, voters. We have told our elected officials that we want accountability in government spending. We want the government to tell us how much they're spending, where they're spending it, and then we want them to make sure that that's a good way to spend the money that we send them all the time, right? Our taxpayer money, where's it going? And a bunch of voters have said many times, we want smaller government. We want you to not only tell us where you're spending the money, but we want you to spend less of it. In doing that, the Congress gets together and says, okay, let's find out where the money's going and let's find out if it's an appropriate way to spend it. The way they determine that is by asking the Office of Inspector General of the federal government to go out and audit different departments within the government. The OIG then brings those audits back and says, this is where the taxpayer money is going. This is what we've discovered in our audit. Now, whether you agree with those audits or not, whether you agree with how they came out, or if you feel like they may have done it wrong, or, there's all kinds of ways you could argue if they're doing it correctly or if it's telling you the right information. But the point is, that's how the system is supposed to work. We're supposed to have this Office of Inspector General that's independent and goes out and says, how are you spending our taxpayer money? Takes that report back to Congress, and Congress says, well, we don't like the way you're spending it, so we're making cuts, or we like the way you're spending it, so we're giving you more money, or it's fine and we leave it the same, right? So just a quick overview of where that all comes from, right? So when you see that the Office of Inspector General, the OIG, comes and says there's a terrible way, this report says that people in P&O are fraudulent and they are billing inappropriately and they're taking all our taxpayer money and wasting it, blah, 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 right? When that comes back, the Congress then says, well, shoot, we have a lot of places to spend our limited funds. And if you guys aren't using it appropriately, we're cutting. So it gives you an idea of where those cuts come from. Now, here's the VA in the same situation where the OIG came, made a report and said, here are some things that are good. Here are some things that are bad. The Congress says, oh, those bad things, we don't want you wasting our money like that. Cut. And then we're going to talk about the new recommendations and the relevance to independent practice. So if you're independent O&P practice in the US and you contract with the VA, or you want to at some point, you would want to know, what does the new contract look like? There's a new national contract template. So right now, any VA anywhere in the country can have their contract kind of look however they want. Now, there is a guideline, obviously, but they can make subtle changes, and it might be different if you live on the East Coast versus the West Coast as to how your contract with your VA would look. Now they're saying here's a national template. All the contracts will look the same, and this is what they'll have. Okay, so the OIG report and VA acquisition of prosthetics limbs happened in 2012. And we know that often it takes a few years for the changes that are in the OIG reports to actually happen. So now here in 2015, we're right at the time where they've had enough time to review it. And then they've had enough time to say, okay, this is what we want to do. And then they're starting to implement. So that's why you're seeing these changes now. So the House of Representatives requested a review of the cost of prosthetic limbs. When they did that, much like the OIG report that happened to P&O overall, or to prosthetics in particular a few years ago, they found overpayments, right? And remember, VISNs are like areas of the country that draw the veterans in those areas to one location for care or to multiple locations for care. So they found a 23% overpayment rate among those VISNs, those care areas, and that equaled about $2.2 million. So notice how before we used to talk about big problems or everybody getting audited and being looked at when we were in the double-digit millions of dollars or even billions of dollars range. Now the audits and the scrutiny is narrowed down, which sounds like a silly kind of, but it's narrowed down to just 2.2 million. I would say, just a few years ago, $2 million wouldn't even have registered. They were so busy taking care of the $50 million problems that they weren't even looking at 2 million. Now that they've got more of a handle on this, you can see that they're starting to look at much more, fine point data. They're looking at more details. And so $2.2 million overpayment rate, obviously they're saying if we spent $2 million over what we should have, if we did that for the next 4 years, we'd be at, that should be 8.8 million, right? If you do the math. I don't know why it came out to 8.6 in the report, but whatever. But basically, many millions of dollars over a few years would be overspent if we don't fix this problem, right? There was also another thing that came out in that report saying that prostheses made at the VA, so if the veteran goes to the VA, goes through the clinic system, and decides they want their care in-house and sees a VA prosthetist or orthotist, then the prosthetics made in the VA cost on average $2,900 a piece. That was upper and lower extremity prosthetics. Whereas the prostheses made at vendor P&Os or outside vendors, so the veteran goes to the clinic system, says, actually, I want to see someone near my home. They go to the outside P&O and see them. Those prostheses cost an average of $12,000 a piece. That's a huge change, right? That's a huge difference. And when Congress sees that, you can bet they probably aren't, or they maybe aren't taking the time to find out why those numbers are different. There are 1,000 reasons why those numbers are so different, and some of them are very benign. Some of it is just, maybe they're not taking into account the time that the practitioner sees the patient within the VA system, right? This number doesn't take into account time. They maybe get different cost of materials. They're only seeing patients that need very minimal prostheses, where the more difficult ones go outside. Who knows? Any number of reasons these numbers could be so very different, but the bottom line is it raises a big red flag. And everybody says, blah, why does it cost so much more when you go outside? We need to investigate, right? So that's kind of where that's coming from, right? Or why that's kind of gives you some background there. And I just want to say again, is eerily familiar to that 2011 OIG report that on Medicare billing of prostheses or billing to Medicare for prostheses. So again, just to let you know, not to say it's going to be scary and awful and there's going to be all this terrible auditing and RACA or anything like that. But just to say that when these OIG reports come down and changes are happening, you need to be very aware of those changes. You need to educate yourself. You need to be on top of it so that when your contract comes up, you're ready to get on board with that and make the changes that you need to make. So be responsive, right? Whereas maybe with that 2011 report, we didn't really know what was going on. It was kind of a shocker, and nobody really knew how to handle that. So maybe we weren't as responsive as we could have been. At this point, we have more experience now, and we can be more responsive to those changes, be aware. And know what changes are needed and follow through. So as far as what the VA response was to this report, obviously they said, well, shoot, we better look into this. If you feel like you're overpaying us and you feel like there's discrepancies, we're going to have internal investigations to figure out what happened. They said they wanted to improve their internal controls over payments for prosthetic limbs. So they're going to improve their systems to say, wait, Did we pay an appropriate amount? If not, why? And how can we change that next time? They wanted to enhance the management and oversight of the prosthetics through the VA as well. So anything that's going on within the VA or outside the VA system, they wanted to track and know where that was going so they could have better information. So what they said is, essentially what they're saying is no more blanket approvals, right? They're not going to just come through and anything you send to them, yep, check it off, check it off, check it off. And you may have had that experience with your local VA. Every VA is a little different right now. So, some might say, yeah, we just approve everything. And some might say, no, we scrutinize everything. It kind of depends on where you're at. The head of the VA nationally, though, is under a lot of pressure to collect detailed data and get that data back to Congress to say, we have made the good changes, we have fixed our systems, don't cut our funding, continue to give us the money that we need to operate, and here's the information you need, and you can see we fixed the problems and what have you. So keeping in mind that the impetus for all of this was really the constituents, right? The people, us, the taxpayers, the voters, saying we want accountability, we want decreased government spending. Well, this is how you get it. You audit, you find the problems, and you cut where you need to cut. So that, again, is kind of the impetus for this. It's not the VA saying, hey, let's go make things more complicated. Obviously, that is not their goal, right? They're just trying to do what Congress is mandating for them. So just to give you some background there, right? So they said, we're going to make a new national contracting template. We're going to make follow-up mandatory. We're going to do patient data tracking. We're going to figure out utilization. Are these patients using the legs that they get long-term? And if so, to do what and how often and all of this. So they want to get more information. And part of that increased oversight means that our documentation as independent P&Os really needs to be in order, right? Unlike maybe before, this could have been your experience, it might not have been, where you didn't really have to be as diligent maybe on the documentation or on the information gathering as you might have been for Medicare post OIG, but now you can look at the same kind of or similar scrutiny. And again, just getting your notes in order, getting the information that's needed in the chart, getting it back to the VA in a timely manner, those kind of things. Not, shouldn't be too incredibly difficult just because we're used to doing it now with Medicare, and we can just hopefully roll that into the VA system. Although, yes, it's a change, and any change is going to be disruptive to your business and a little difficult. It's hopefully going to be a nice gradual change where you can modify it over time. So that will be good. Okay, so the new contract recommendations for the national contract were presented again in New Orleans at the Academy meeting by VA employees themselves, right? So I'm just going to hit the highlights here, the things that I found were like, whoa, huge, fascinating, interesting, something that we really want to prep for as independent P&Os. So outcome monitoring and utilization tracking, Congress literally said, if we're giving all this money for people to make prosthetic limbs and use prosthetic limbs for veterans to have them, then what are they doing with them? We want to make sure that we're happy to spend that money as long as it's benefiting those vets, right, is what they were saying. So tell us what it looks like a year later or 3 years later when this veteran is out using this leg. Have they gotten back the function that we hope they would when we prescribed the leg in the first place? So that's kind of the impetus to get more information. And they also wanted to show good service and good follow-up by requiring a semi-annual service. And we're going to talk about the details about like how you would bill that, how many units and all of this. Then they also said, let's control some costs. Let's get a handle on that by giving more guidelines as to how to bill out and code for 99 codes, right? They have specific items that have miscellaneous codes, and a certain way of doing that now that's very clear and laid out, obviously. So that's kind of helpful. There's no more kind of gray area, or there will be less gray area on how 99 codes work, which is a good thing potentially. Makes it easier on you, hopefully. Okay, so as far as outcome monitoring and utilization tracking goes, the VA has the option now in this new contracting template, right, and under these new rules, to prescribe a quote unquote automated prosthetic utilization and function monitoring device. Well, what would that be? Okay, so it's a device, hopefully, that would record the stance and swing time for gait symmetry, would have dynamic function, including would record dynamic function, including alignment, forces, moments, blah blah blah. cadence and cadence variability, step count, longitudinal historical objective analysis. I'm not going to read the rest of these. We only have an hour, but you get the idea. They came up with a list of things that they wanted information about. And this was through a big work group through the VA. They came together. They brought a bunch of people together and said, if we're going to collect data, what data do we want to collect? And then how are we going to do that? And when they said, how are we going to do that? They actually picked a couple of devices that are going to work for what they wanted to collect. So what does that mean? It means that, yes, the VA wants, under this new contracting template, wants to gather this data for utilization of prosthetic limbs, but especially lower limb prosthetics, but they're not saying, so go out there and just use whatever you want. Like Medicare said, hey, it'd be great if you could tell us if they're using that. However you want to do that is fine. In the VA scenario, they're saying, yes, we want to collect that information, but we're going to tell you exactly how to collect it. We have a certain device, or in this case, 2 devices that we want to use, that we've chosen to make sure it's kind of more across the board, right? So again, the whole impetus for this is Congress saying, we're spending a lot on prosthetics. How are you using them? And the VA coming back at them and saying, we'll show you how we use them. We'll collect data. So to get it back to, bottom line for you and your company, let's talk about what the 2 devices are. So the VA, again, looked at a bunch of different outcomes and monitoring devices, from a Fitbit, which you're probably familiar with, to a Nike, whatever it's called, the thing that goes in the shoe, Fuel or something like that. Maybe that's the wrist one, whatever. They looked at Nike, Fitbit, a bunch of other off-the-shelf stuff. They also looked at some more research-based or more traditionally research-based things, like the Modus, which we have known in the past in P&O as the stepwatch. So similar device, kind of reinvented for this VA contract. And the Europa, which was a product that came out a while ago from OrthoCare Innovations, which has again been sort of revamped for this particular set of requirements from the VA. So those 2 devices are the ones that they've chosen. The Modus Trex, again, it used to be called the stepwatch. It's a little different now, so we'll go into detail on that. And the Europa, which we'll talk a little less about because it's not quite available yet. Those would be billed to the VA using a 5999 code. And they will be paid at 1.5 times the cost of the device to the P&O company. So whether it's on a new prosthesis or whether it's on a prosthesis for someone who's used it prior, and how it's implemented is really up to the VA itself. So when the VA clinic team gets together and sees the patient and makes an assessment, decides what the patient's going to have, they may at that time prescribe either a Trex or a Europa or both. And that would come to you as the outside provider, for the outside P&O provider, that would come to you on the prescription. And on the prescription, it would say, here's the prescription for the full prosthesis. And by the way, we also want you to do a Modus Trex and or a Europa to collect this data and give us that data back later. And then they will pay you, again, you'll bill that out with a 99 code, and they'll pay you 1.5 times the cost of that device to you. And if you'd have to have the manufacturer's invoice on that. As we'll talk about with all the rest of the 99 codes, you'll need the manufacturer's invoice. So what does it say about, utilization and outcomes tracking for P&O that the VA is now asking for these things or might ask for these things? It's really maybe a heads up for all of us that what happens at the VA typically spreads out to other insurers or other payers. What happens in Medicare typically spreads out to other payers like private insurance. So they're all kind of in cahoots, right? And they all kind of work together and like, oh, you're getting some good results over there with that. Well, maybe we'll try it over here at our private insurance level too. Is that going to happen tomorrow? I don't know. Is that going to happen in 3 years? Maybe. But the point is, it feels like that tide is sort of turning. And we can say, look, if the VA is requiring this and if they get the data they want, it seems to be good, or if they want to implement this system because Congress is asking for it, then you might see this in other areas as well. So it's something to really have your radar up about, to say, wow, maybe, I need to really focus on those outcomes and utilization going forward for a lot of my patients. I can start with the VA patients and then I might spread that out to my other patients because it's probably going to be coming soon to others. All we can say at this moment is maybe sooner than later. We don't know. But, and that little square says what I just said. So I'll pull that down. Okay, so let's talk about what these individual items are, these individual devices are. The Europa is the device or the unit that's going to report on gait symmetry, dynamic function, and socket load. So as you might suspect, it's going to have sort of a strain gauge set up where it's going to say, among other things, it's, I guess, more complicated than that, but basically it's going to say what kind of strains and stresses are happening in the socket, and that's going to translate to pressures in the socket potentially. So that's what the Europa would do. It would satisfy this part of the information gathering that the VA is asking for now, or may ask you for. Now the Europa is not currently available. I guess it's really close to being available, but you couldn't. I think it's still the case. You can't just call today and grab a Europa off the shelf. So we're not going to focus on that as much here as the one that is available right now, which is this Modus Trex. You may have a few years ago purchased or started using a stopwatch monitor through, I think that was through OrthoCare Innovations as well. And you'll remember it's just like a little tiny unit that you strap on the ankle, and then it has a dock that you lay it in that kind of downloads the information that it collected over several days on your patient to the computer, and you can have a report from that. So the Modus Trex is the same device. However, the software has been changed significantly, and the way it interacts, the way it collects the information and how it puts it into your computer is different. So if you have stopwatch units in your office now, they're not going to be compatible with this new Modus Trex software or set up for the VA. Just wanted to throw that out there. If you're thinking, oh, I'll just use these that I haven't used yet, unfortunately, they're not going to be compatible. But the new software that goes with the new Modus Trex kind of stopwatch looking things also collects all this information here that the VA has requested. So the VA said, if we're going to collect data, this is the data we want to collect. And so if you do get a prescription for a Trex, then the software will give you the report exactly tuned to what the VA has requested. So you don't have to pull out certain data points or kind of massage the data or anything. You just would give the report directly out of the software, because again, the software was revamped to meet the needs of this VA contract. So again, these are two separate items, and you may get a prescription that asks for both of these on one prosthesis. So there's some gadget stuff going on there, right? You have to get your gadget tolerance up. So consider, if your VA is starting to ask for these, jumping on that and kind of learning this one that's available now. And then when the Europa becomes available, you'll be ready to go, as opposed to having like tackle both at the same time. They're pretty simple as far as software and interaction, but there's always a learning curve, right? So the downside may be, okay, well, now we've got a lot of data that we're going to be collecting. This is a lot of information that you will have to understand, sift through, kind of apply to your patient functionally. The upside is that it really gives some fascinating data, and it can really help confirm what you're doing clinically. So when you have a patient that comes in, your experience tells you that they need this, this, and this. And based on what we see with a lot of outcome measures and a lot of data collection, your experience as a prosthetist who's been in the field for a number of years, it almost always is correct, right? Way more than half the time, 60, 70% of the time. I can't remember the exact numbers from the research, but most of the time, our experienced eye and our experienced educated guesses and our treatment plans are correct and corroborate the data collected from any data collection device we use. So along those lines, when you get the information back from like a Modus Trex or something on the patient, what you'll see is often it really confirms the suspicions you had. You think, oh, I think probably this guy has a, uneven step length, or he has some cadence variability, but he needs a certain foot to have more cadence variability. And almost always you'll see that data really proves that out for you. So that's really nice. It can help you explain issues and help back up your clinical opinion. That's why it's kind of important not to just track the information, but actually understand how that data applies to the components you selected or to the to the plan that you've created for your patient. So that's going to take a little getting used to. You're just going to learn how that software works and kind of get used to trying it out and using it on your patients. And it will become like any other tool that you use, much easier as you do it. So that's kind of the outcome measured utilization tracking piece of it. And those are just a quick rundown of the products that you might get a prescription for going forward. This is being rolled out throughout the country kind of slowly. So you may have like your VA locally, you may go to them tomorrow and say, hey, I just saw this webinar and they said you want me to start using utilization monitors. And they might say, I don't know what the heck you're talking about. Or you might have some that say, oh yeah, we're coming to you directly and saying, we want these outcome utilization things applied to your patients right away. They may be very proactive about it and they may not. So it really still is variable based on your own VA locally. So you could talk to them about that or understand what's required. So moving on to another piece of it. And again, if you have any questions, just type them in there to the question box and I'll stop and answer those. But I'll keep going unless someone has something specific. So the semi-annual service is another piece of the VA national contract that's changed or is going to be applied pretty soon. So what's really awesome about this is now you're getting paid for follow-up. Like how many years have we said in P&O we need to get paid for follow-up? And here we're getting paid for it, right? And very, very clearly. And I apologize, you know what? This should say up to 4 units per visit, not per year. So please disregard that. That's the VA would pay for 4 units of 7520 per visit. So that would be 8 units per year because they are asking you to do 2 service visits throughout the year. So if you deliver a prosthesis to a veteran through the VA system in January, then twice through the rest of the year, at least 2 times the rest of the year, you need to see that patient and follow up and do, check on them and make sure all the components are working correctly and document that and what have you. But you would also get paid for that time, right? So you have the ability to bill the VA for that for 8 units per year or 4 units per visit. Again, I apologize. This slide is incorrect. So keep that in mind. And so that's just really cool. I mean, the bottom line is that it's interesting that they have said we really want to implement this, and they're putting their money where their mouth is, kind of, right? They're saying, okay, now you're going to get paid for follow-up, and you can use that required visit to really build the case for the next prosthesis, right? Not to say that you're going to do that inappropriately, but it gives you a little bit of a cushion to be able to track your patient and gather data throughout the year, and then the next year and the next year, and by the end of it, year 2, 3 years, you've got really nice information about that person that says, hey, the prosthesis is working great. It's getting a little older now. We're seeing a decrease in their functionality. Here's what it's due to. It would give you this backup of information, this backup plan that where you can go to the VA and say, now 3 years later, 5 years later, it's time for a new prosthesis. And look, I've got all this great information that supports the need for it. Instead of just saying, it's been 3 years, it's time for a new one, without any real good data, right? So anyway, super cool about that. I just think it's really nice, a really good thing that they're finally paying for follow-up. It's kind of a big deal. And again, this would be one of those things we hope would trickle out to the rest of the payers that we work with, Medicare or private insurers or whatever. Will it happen yet? I don't know, but hopefully if it works well with the VA system, it would kind of move out to the rest of the systems, the rest of the payers. So the other thing that's changed that is really cool, standardized payments and standardized ways of billing for 99 codes. Now, this slide should also say 7499. So it's not just for lower extremity prosthetic codes, it's also for upper extremity prosthetic codes. So standardized payments for 5999 and 7499. So the VA calls those 99 codes or miscellaneous codes not otherwise classified codes or not codes, NOC. And you would need to, for a 99 code going forward with this new template for the contract, with your new contract that you'll get hopefully soon, you would be able to show the manufacturer's invoice on whatever miscellaneous coded or NOC codes that you're using, and they would pay that at 1.5 times your cost for the component. Now that definition of an NOC code in this context is something that's mass manufactured. It must have an invoice, and the VA is going to decide what is an NOC code and what is not. So so if you're making items or you're sort of custom making a certain component in your office and you put a 99 code on it, meaning that you wouldn't have a mass manufactured unit in there and you wouldn't have a manufacturer's invoice for it, that wouldn't qualify for this. So you wouldn't be paid in this way for that item. It would have to be a standard component that has a 99 code attached to it. The other thing to realize, just to be clear on little nuances here, is that you can only have one 99 code or one NOC code per component. So let's say in the case of like a knee, you have a knee that has several features that are coded out, and more than one of those features are coded with a 99 code. That would be denied. You would only have one code for that knee that would have a 99, would be a 99 code, or 199 code per item. All right. Multiple 99 codes for each prosthesis are okay. So, right, 199 code per component, but you could have a prosthesis that has several components in it that are listed under an NOC or a 99 code, and that would be okay, depending on how your prescription came down from the VA, et cetera. So there's some nuances there, but in general, it kind of streamlines how you're going to get paid for those 99 codes and makes it much clearer about how that will happen. So hopefully that's helpful in that you have some clear guidelines. And I just wanted to highlight here that the single component with multiple 99 codes is not going to be paid under this new system, right? Yeah, it can only have the 199 per component. Okay. Hopefully that's clear. Awesome. Okay, so those are all the really major changes to my mind anyway. Someone else might read that contract and say, oh, this is a major change she didn't talk about. But those are the things that I feel have like big ramifications for us overall in P&O, and especially for an independent P&O practice. Those are things that you're going to have to keep straight along with everything else you're keeping track of and trying to keep up with that are really going to hit your bottom line potentially. So you really want to be educated about it. So again, the highlights from the VA OIG report are just Congress saying, look, you're spending a lot of money in the VA. What are we getting for it? And the VA saying, we're going to show you. We're going to collect data. We're going to show you what you get for that money. And so again, that trickles down to you to say that you're going to see some changes in the prescriptions that you get from your VA. And of course, you're going to see some changes based on your new national contract, hopefully soon. And so again, the VA responded with changes to that contract. The new recommendations have relevance to you again as a small independent practice because you really want to be aware that when you go up for a renewal for your contract with your VA, if they don't bring up the fact that there's a new national contracting template, you might want to bring that up because they are supposed to be implementing that, and you want to make sure that that you're getting the latest greatest, right? Because if they just renew your contract as is, then it could be that when it comes down mandated that they have to change it, you'd have to get in there for a new contract again. So you just skip that step. And then, of course, the follow-up recommendations and payment for that and utilization tracking. Again, one more device that you're going to need to learn and figure out, and you may expect over the next few weeks, months, or year to see more prescriptions coming to you that ask for either a Europa or a Modus Trex or both. And that's something you really want to kind of be aware of, get on board with early because it's a little complicated. Okay. So those are kind of the overall ideas about that new contract, and hopefully you found this helpful to give you some information about how to get in sync with that over the next, again, 6 months, years, as this thing as this new contract trickles out there to you, you'll have a heads up about what's coming. Of course, you want to read that whole contract thoroughly. We know that. And then, of course, thank you to SPS for sponsoring this webinar and for paying for the credits. So If you have any questions, comments, you didn't understand part of it, you want more clarification, you have questions about documentation at all for any payer, here's my contact information. This is my cell phone number, so you can get a hold of me. Obviously, you can email me. And then if you're a Twitter type person, you can follow my tweets on Twitter. So, oh, someone says, where can we get the handout? The handout is actually on the SPS website. So if you go to the SPS website on the code page, you can scroll down on the main page, you'll see a little code icon, click that, then scroll way down to the bottom of the page and you'll see webinar 10. And that's where you'll uh, get the handouts. Oh yes, and you're right, Texas is the best, I agree. So anyway, okay, so that's how you get a hold of me. That's how you can follow the tweets. The tweets, I try to put out information that's timely and will hopefully help your business, a little heads up on what's coming down the pike, right? So yeah, do contact me if you have questions. Thank you so much for attending this webinar.